Good morning.
Good morning.
We are looking in the book of Genesis. We've called this series The Good Life, thinking about particularly travelling through the story of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. We haven't got to much of Isaac and haven't got to Jacob yet. But thinking about Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the life that God has promised them, and really unpacking that idea of what does the good life look like. And we get to this story that we just read in Genesis chapter 23, which is quite a strange story. One of the things I did this week is I tried out Google's new deep research tool as part of Gemini, their AI project. And you can plug something into it and it'll research a whole bunch of websites and give you like a 5-page summary of its research. So I did that, just kind of gathering stuff together as I prepared my sermon. But at the top there was a little button that kind of said, produce an infographic. And I was like, an infographic for the sermon, that's got to be helpful for everyone. So I clicked that, and what it did was it turned this Bible passage into an investment diagram about how much money Abraham spent on this land, and it went through, this is the steps he took to buy the land, here's the negotiation deals, and here's the value of the land compared to other land that is bought in the Bible around the same time. I didn't show it to you, but it gives you a bit of a picture of what the image we get from this story. It's a strange story because it is a story about investment. It is a story that goes through all this detail about their negotiation and how much they spent and how much they wanted to spend. It's quite unusual. It is an important passage for a number of reasons, and we always look at a Bible passage and try to unpack why God has given us this particular story. One of the reasons is it's important as we think about the promises that are given to Abraham, and one of them was that he would have a promise of land. But up until now in the story, there hasn't been any land. Abraham's a traveller and he doesn't own any land. And God said, I'll give you this land, but he hasn't seen any of that promise fulfilled. And this is the first glimpse of that promise. There's another important thing to Israel here, and this is an official buying into the land of Canaan. It established the relationships between the other Canaanites at the time. I mean, we look at, I'm not trying to make any political statements about the state of Israel at the moment, but for Israel, this is quite important to them that this is something that happened early on, a deal that was struck that gives some investment and ownership into that land. So that's a picture that we get. But I think the most critical thing in this story for us, as we think about this story, comes from, we get a glimpse of it in verse 4, in the way Abraham identifies himself. This is what he said in verse 4. He says that he is, here I am, a stranger and foreigner among you. This is the picture of Abraham. This is his identity the whole way through. He is a traveller. He's not someone who has settled down and stuck in a certain place. And it's a picture we get of God's people the whole way through the Bible. That even when God's people are in the land of Israel, there's a sense where that home is not their permanent home truly. And the Bible keeps talking about this eternal home. And in the New Testament, it's very clear. We are like Abraham. Foreigners is the language that Peter uses. We are strangers, the same words that Abraham uses. We are, I'll use the word travellers like Abraham. This life is got a temporary element to it. And that really comes ahead in this story at the very opening. Because the very opening of this story is the death of Sarah. And it's quite significant because here's the journey we've been following through. God has given Abraham immortal promises, right? Immortal promises, your name will be great. Your descendants will be like stars in the sky. There's an infinite picture with his descendants. All nations on earth will be blessed through you. There's an infinite element of that picture. And so Abraham has been given immortal promises. Almost every chapter that talks about Abraham in Genesis reminds us of those promises. And yet this chapter starts with mortality. This chapter starts with the death of Sarah. So here is Abraham, who has the immortal promises, faces Sarah's mortality, or really his own mortality in that sense. And so the first thing we want to look about as we think of the traveller is the traveller's loss that we face. This is part of what it means to be a traveller in this life. With those opening verses that talk about Sarah, show us a little bit of how important she is as a character in the Bible. One significant thing about her is it tells us how many years she lived. She is the only woman in the Bible that happens, we're told how many years she lived. So a number of men we're told how long they lived, but she's the only woman we're told that, which shows us something about the significant role she plays in her lifespan in being part of the promise of God in bearing the promised child in Isaac. So she's significant, and also we see that she's significant to Abraham. We're told that he weeps for her. This is the first time in the Bible that we're told anyone has shed a tear. The words weeping has not happened thus far. All the things that have happened in the Bible, no one, we've been told, has cried for those things. And so she's significant in the Bible. She's significant to Abraham. And as we think about what it means to be a traveller, there's a reminder there that this life we suffer loss and we grieve that loss. In fact, we are created to grieve. We have a gift of grief. That's a bit of a strange thing to think about, isn't it? The first thought on the gift of grief is that we have the gift of tears. Humanity is the only creature on the planet that cries for emotional reasons. Many animals have tear ducts, but we're the only creature that cries, that lets out emotion in that way. And it is a gift in the sense that it is a way for us to express the grief, to let out the grief. But it's not just an expression of grief. It's actually an honouring of the joy that we have lost, that grief created. I'll give you an illustration. A number of years ago, a few years ago, we went to Raging Waters with our kids, and it was a busy day. You know, we waited in lines for way too long. And when we came to the end of the day, we stayed as late as we thought we could because of the kids' bedtime, and then we said it's time to go home. And Jet was greatly grieved. And the memory of Jet being so upset brings me great joy. And not because I'm a cruel father and I love to see that pain on his face. What that grief told me that day is he loved that experience so much that he hadn't had enough of it. That it was actually the joy of the experience pouring out as it came to an end. That's what was generating the grief that he had. And it was just great to see he had loved it that much that he just didn't want to see it end. And there's a strange reality to grief that exists for us as well. When someone dies in our life, that is part of the grief we feel. The grief exists because of the joy. The grief exists because of the hope of the life that was lived and what is going to be lost because of that. The grief exists because of the gift. And in that sense, we live as travellers, enjoying elements of this life, but also in the recognition that there is a limit to what we experience in this life. That the joy is limited in a sense. And so we are given the gift of grief, but also we want to live with the reality of death in our minds and not forget that it's something that's real. The Bible doesn't shy away from acknowledging death. It doesn't shy away from acknowledging the reality of death. There's a danger that sometimes we do want to kind of ignore it, pretend it's not there. It's a horrible thing. People sometimes use the language of it's our last real enemy. Death is a horrible thing. The Bible meets that head on and acknowledges death. In fact, there's some verses we read at funerals that sound like really beautiful verses until you realise what they're talking about. And then can be quite confronting verses. Sounds like even a love letter type thing. Like here's an example. This is Peter. He says this. He says, "Your beauty is like a flower in the field. And then he says, the grass withers and the flowers fade. That's what your beauty is like. It withers and fades. Lovely. That's probably not your opening to, your proposal of marriage. Your beauty withers and flowers fade. There's another one we read all the time in Psalm 103, which says this. Once again, it sounds beautiful. Our days on earth are like grass, like wildflowers. We bloom and die. It continues on. It says, the wind blows and we are gone, as though we had never been here. They sound really quite confronting, and in certain contexts you would say they're really out of place. They're not the kind of thing. It's not the letter you write in your Valentine's Day card or that sort of thing. But we often read them at funerals, and they never feel out of place. They always feel right, because the reality is there before us. We can't ignore it anymore. We can't pretend it's not there. And the most healthy thing for us to do is recognise it. There's a reality as travellers in this world that we live in the face of loss. We face life with the reality of death. That is what we see. But we also, as Christian travellers, face death with the reality of life, because we have a hope beyond that. In fact, Peter's words in that passage before are spoken exactly in that context. If we put part of that back up, Peter said that line, our days on earth are like, not that one, the grass withers and the flowers fade. But this is what he said just before that. He says, you've been born again, but not to a life that will quickly end. Your new life will last forever, but because it comes from the eternal living word of God. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord, the source of that life, it will last forever. And so there's a picture of not just recognizing we live life with the reality of death, we also face death with the hope of life. Both these things are true as travellers in this world. And so we live with that in mind. We live for eternity. In fact, Peter uses those words of travellers. He uses the words as temporary residents. This is what he says about living our lives for eternity. He says, as temporary residents and foreigners, be careful to live properly amongst your unbelieving neighbours. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honourable behaviour and they will give honour to God when he judges the world. There's a picture there of facing death with that life, eternal life, that we live our lives knowing that we're travellers, and so not living for this life, but living for honouring God and the life to come. Abraham's life illustrates that picture in two ways. We see the picture of the traveller's loss, but in Abraham's story we also see the picture of the traveller's cost. And that is the cost of being honourable in our lives and the cost of being a traveller. The first thing is the cost of being honourable. We get this picture of Abraham that there's some picture we get that he has sought to honour God. We've seen in his life that he has made some serious mistakes. But verse 4, he says, please sell me a piece of land. He doesn't take it by force. We've seen that he has a whole lot of soldiers with him, but he doesn't take it by force. He is an honourable man in seeking to buy it. The next thing we see is people treat him with honour. They say, you are an honoured prince amongst us. Choose the finest of our tombs. And so we get this picture that Abraham has lived to some extent an honourable life amongst people, but we see that particularly in this story, in this transaction deal. We see Abraham showing honour in a place where he could actually get the cheap option. He chooses to pay the cost. It's quite a strange story, this story of Abraham and Ephron and this negotiation about this tomb. For starters, there seems to be a lot of bowing. A lot of bowing going on in this story. Verse 7, then Abraham bowed low before the Hittites, right? And then he has this strange interaction. He says, he asks for a tomb. They say, you can take one. And then he does this weird thing. First of all, he asks if they will speak to Ephron, but we're told Ephron is there in their midst. I don't know if him and Ephron had a fight before now, and they're like, you tell Ephron that I said this. But he says, since you're willing to help me in this way, be so kind as to ask Ephron, son of Zohar, to let me buy his cave at Machpelah. So the first thing is, it's weird that he's talking to Ephron. Maybe he doesn't know he's there. He's talking about Ephron, communicating through them. The second thing is his very specific request. Like, he's like, you can have any cave. Oh, I know. I've got one in mind. Down at the end of the field, he says. He's been on burialsareus.com. He's been on Domain, and he's found the proper site, the location he wants. That's the second kind of strange thing that's happening here. And the third strange thing is he's obsessed with witnesses. You see that through this passage? I will pay the full price, he says, in the presence of witnesses. That's the strange thing that's going on for Abraham. It seems similarly strange for Ephron because he is also obsessed with witnesses. Although he does seem like he's trying to show off his generosity. He says, Ephron was sitting there, verse 10, amongst the others, right? There's witnesses there. And he answered Abraham as the others listened, we're told, speaking publicly, so they can hear, of course, before all the Hittite elders of the town. And then he says, my Lord, please listen to me. I will give you the field and the cave here in the presence of my people. I give it to you. He seems more interested not at the witnesses in the sense of transaction, but the witnesses in the sense of seeing his generosity. And then we get this bow off between the two of them. Verse 12, again Abraham bowed before the citizens of the land. He says, Ephron says, please listen to me, I will give you the field. Abraham says, no, listen to me. I will buy it from you. Let me pay the full price. Ephron answers, my Lord, please listen to me. And then he does this thing that sounds like they could be friends, right? He says, my Lord, please listen to me. The land is worth 400 pieces of silver. But what is that between friends? Go ahead and bury your dead. It sounds like they could be friends, although I'm pretty convinced by the whole interaction they're not friends. And one of the most telling things about it is what happens next. Listen to the details of this transaction. This doesn't sound like two guys making a deal. It says, Abraham agreed to Ephron's price and paid the amount he had suggested, 400 pieces of silver. Then it adds, weighed according to the market standard, and the Hittite elders witnessed the transaction. These are not details you add if two guys that are good, get along well together, kind of exchanging a deal. This is some level of tension that's going on here. That's the first hint we get that it's not a friendly deal. The second one is the price, 400 shekels of silver. Now, it's difficult for us to estimate what that's worth, but what we can do is compare it to other sales that happen. I should have given you the infographic. Other sales that have happened in the Bible. But for example, David buys a business. He buys a threshing floor and ox for 50 shekels. You know, that's 350 shekels less than a cave and a field. Jeremiah buys a field for 17 shekels. That's significantly, I mean, this cave must be some nice cave if it's worth that much above just the cost of the field. It seems pretty clear that 400 shekels actually is overpriced. So what's going on here with all this detail is that Abraham is acting honourably. He's going over and above to make sure he's doing the right thing. And his integrity here costs him, and it costs him quite heavily. But the reality is, this is what it means for him to be a traveller, is the cost of seeking to live for God and living honourably no matter what he faces. And we think about that ourselves as travellers when it comes to things like ethics in business, in the workplace, in our jobs. That if we are to live as travellers in this world living for eternity, then we will seek to do the right thing, even in times that it might cost us more. It means living generously, being generous with everything we have in order to show love for others. I think there's a danger in particularly Western society. Lots of things have set up in our society to help care for those who are in need. Most of those things are the legacy of Christian heritage, things like our Centrelink social provisions for people who are out of jobs, those sorts of things. They come from a Christian heritage, but there's a danger actually that Christians say, well, we've set those things up. We no longer need to live generously. We can let the system care for the people and we will just go on living for ourselves. If we are to do that, we are actually to dishonour that heritage that we have from all that work that has been done. It is because Christians seek to care and love for the poor and outcast that we now have a world that cares to some extent for the poor and the outcasts. And to live as travellers, we face the traveller's cost. That is the cost of living and giving generously. The cost of living counterculturally when the world values things differently to us. So the cost for Abraham is a cost of integrity. But the second cost is the cost that it means to be a traveller. That is, he has to pay this money because he owns no land. And the reality is that we think about people who are not investing in this life, investing in the life to come, there is a cost to that. And so we don't just have the traveller's cost, we have the traveller's legacy, an investment in God's kingdom. This land purchase in this little chapter, this little story about a little negotiation, is the first instalment of the promised land for God's people. It's the first bit of land. Sarah actually doesn't live to see the day when they own some of the promised land, but she is buried in that land. It's the family burial, so Abraham is buried in that land. Other family members are buried in that land. It's the first instalment. So Abraham's investment is an investment in God's plans and God's kingdom. And it's helpful for us to also think about what it looks like to be travellers and how we invest in God's plans and God's kingdom. And we do that in a lot of ways. We do that in the way we make decisions about priorities. We had an opportunity this week in my house to have that conversation with our kids about thinking about our priorities. This week, the game Fortnite had a global event. You could join Luke Skywalker in defeating Palpatine and destroying the Death Star, right? The problem with the global event is it happened at 4 a.m. this morning, right? 2 o'clock in America, good for them. 4 a.m. here. And so there was a conversation, Susie and I talked about, this is good. Jet and I, Olive, have been playing a little bit of Fortnite, but Jet's particularly interested. A little bit of a conversation saying sometimes we don't do things because our investment in the kingdom is that we prioritise church. I mean, it helps that I'm preaching and kind of have to be here, but we prioritise church. We're not going to get up at 4 a.m. and then be too tired for church. Of course, at 4 a.m. this morning, I had another lesson to teach Jet, and that was sometimes we get up at 4 a.m. and do things, and then we still go to church. That's the investment lesson we want to learn. After all, the galaxy needed saving. When we woke him up this morning, I said, this is the second part of the deal. No grumpiness or I am fried. There are moments that we try to teach our kids what priorities look like and how we balance those priorities, what decisions we make for things that we want to enjoy in this life versus an investment in God's kingdom. One of the greatest ways we do that, we've already talked about this in our service today, but the idea of giving regularly to the work of the church is one way that we quite tangibly invest in kingdom work, because the church is funded by people in our church that give to it, and we use those funds to employ staff to help manage the church, to help enable ministry to happen. So that's one way. Another way is giving to mission organisations and our link missionaries. It's a good opportunity for me to say Dave Sinden, one of our link missionaries, is actually short on some of the funding that he needs to raise. And so I want to encourage you that if you have capacity maybe to give towards that you sign up to help him out with reaching his funding goals. It's part of what we're thinking about with our Thanksgiving this week, our Thanksgiving offertory. I want to take a moment to talk about another kingdom investment that we have before us at a church. And I'll try to do this quickly, but I want to just take a moment to lay this out before you. We've been talking a lot about this, but the reality is we are asking the question about what the future of our church looks like with, the limitations on this facility that we're on right now. We're building a church up on Hamilton Street. We're hoping 3 years maybe that will be done. But we're working on how we build investment, use this facility here. Now, this becomes tricky for us. We are, for a government grant, we're raising the roof here, and there's going to be a little bit of extra things that need to be done to finish that job off. We're just raising these kind of 10 metres here, exposing the rafters and trying to make the room feel a bit bigger. We're going to do that, and there's a little bit of investment for us, even though we're not going to be here long term, because we want to just not let anything hold back moving forward as a church. One of the great challenges for us is to figure out the limitations of this building. For example, how many people can we fit in here and grow? And the reality of church is that churches generally experience a growth barrier that happens. Growth stops when a church room is 80% full. That's a tricky kind of thing to think through. But I said this a couple of weeks ago. Church is fantastic, and it's a taste of God's kingdom together, and it should be a sellout concert. But the reality is, in this life, it isn't a sellout concert. And so people aren't going to come and squeeze side by side and take tickets at the door to fit in, and we'll use every nook and cranny to fill this church. The reality is, if we want to reach people who are on the fringes of our church or not even sure about church at all, we need to create a space where they feel welcome and comfortable and not packed in like sardines. And so a church will tend to grow. They say after COVID it's actually 70% full. I don't know if that's true. I think we can fit 200 in here. Last week we had 140 on just a regular Sunday. And that includes kids, and they were only in for the parts of the service last week. But you can see if it's 70% full, we're starting to feel this. 200 people with the coffee machine out and pushing chairs all the way back. So we're starting to feel those challenges. Our car park is actually a greater challenge. I think we have about 50 car park spaces, depending on how tight we park on the gravel. About 20 on the street before you're walking too far that you feel like it's a distance. That's around 100 adults, assuming some share cars and some don't. That means that we actually last week had 90 adults at church, and I know many are parking out on the street to free that up. I want to say it's very hard for us to figure out where the line is that we need to make serious decisions. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, I'd said what we need to do is have 2 family services on a Sunday morning, and then we would be able to enable much more growth. Because we're moving off-site, I think, because we're moving to another site, I think a better plan for us moving forward is to consider moving to a school where we stay as one service. We will bring the 8 o'clock service in, because I don't think we can run 2 services off-site, and run 1 service on a Sunday in a school. Now, I imagine I don't have to explain to you the complications with something like that. And it's not, the juggle between those two is hard. I've been asking our leadership team, our church board, some of their values on this. Like, for example, if we're not here on a Sunday, we could hire it out to another church, but we will pay higher at another facility. So that could work out cost neutral. The band, the music team, if they were here, they come in for 2 services because I don't think we could swap bands between services. That's a long morning. But if we go off-site, we've got to set up everything. That's a long morning. Probably one of the biggest things for us is our kids ministry. To run 2 kids ministries off-site really means, even though they're set up, to run 2 kids ministries here would mean doubling our kids ministry team. Some people might be able to double up their amount of serving, but we are really struggling to run 1 kids program. I don't think we have the resources to run 2. So I'm thinking we need to think about where we might meet in the future. The question becomes when, and because we're selling, we want to look to sell this building. For the sake of a sale, we may need to consider moving sooner rather than later in order to lock in a sale. This is a very unique sales site. We've got a heritage building. We've got a heritage tree. That's fun. And so it makes it very limited on what we can do here. The best plan for everything, including the legacy of the ministry here, is another church buys it. That would be the ideal, to see church ministry continue on this site. I'm having chats with churches about that. There's a couple that are potential, one that's really keen, and they're real keen real soon, and we might need to ask those questions. Here's where I think that lands for us, and then I'll wrap up the sermon. I think October this year or September, October next year is what we're thinking. I think that's around the ideal time to move, coming out of the colder months. But we will need to, October this year is very soon. And so these are pretty serious conversations going on. So I want to let you know that that's what we're doing here. And I want to pull it back to what we're talking about kingdom investment. These challenges come with great costs. A number of years ago, someone challenged me when talking about vision stuff to not use the word difficult. It's going to be difficult. The word is, it's going to be a challenge, right? Give you some inspiration there. It's going to be a difficult challenge, is the reality. And there's going to be cost. And one of the things we want to build as a culture in our church when it comes to serving is we want to have a culture where we own the costs together. We want our teams to work together and own the outcomes of what we do and share them together. And that's going to be true of something like this. This is going to be a shift depending where we move, the time frames that happens, the setup that will be involved each Sunday if we do that, for how long we need to do that. We're thinking about serious questions about what midweek ministries would look like, our playgroup, our youth ministry, our one-off events, our gingerbread event, our alpha course. Our hope would be to sell to another church and have an arrangement that we can lease back from them some of those things. But that's where we're at. So I'll invite you, as we think about what it looks like to live as travellers in this life, to think about how we keep investing in the kingdom. The reality is we could not do anything. We could say, if we're not thinking about travellers, if we're thinking about ourselves, then we'd say, I'm comfortable here. And we can, if other people aren't comfortable filling up the room, I'm comfortable filling up the room, just let it be. And I think the outcome will be we will limit the opportunities we have to share Jesus with more and more people. And so I think these are challenges we need to face. We live as travellers in this life. And this story from Abraham reminds us exactly how that is. That there's awareness of the finitude of this life, the brevity of the life, that there is a limit to how long we will be here. And that brings with it some sorrow because of the joy that we experience and that joy lost. It also helps remind us that there is a limited time here for us to serve God, and we should be working hard with all we have. It's about embracing the cost that comes to be a traveller. And it's about investing in the legacy of God's kingdom here on this earth as we look towards living for the future.